Sister Library was started by Aqui Thami. She's an indigenous artist from Bombay, who lives in Bombay. She's from the hills in India, and she started Sister Library like as a project. It's an art project that is also a physical space, and she does something similar with her space where she has like regular readings, and then she has a podcast, and then she has a space where she has a collection of books. So right before the pandemic in February of 2020, the Goethe-Institut, they contacted HerStory Foundation and they said, like, we have a bit of funds to bring Aki over to Dhaka, and she wants to bring like 100 books from her collection. So she'll bring 100 books and she'll pack them in a suitcase and she'll bring them for 4 days during the Dhaka Art Summit, and we'll install them. So we installed them for 4 days. We made a pink shelf and we made this like pop-up Sister Library. And then there was a lot of like interest. There was a lot of like good feedback. So we decided to keep the pink shelf since we already made it, and start growing our own collection. And then pandemic happened and we couldn't do physical readings, so we started doing readings online. So we've been doing this for about 2 years now, and we've read everything from plays to poetry to children's books. And we invite elder sisters to guide us through text, because it's not like the format doesn't allow for us to read a whole book or like a full essay, because it's an hour and a half. But the elder sister kind of brings her own experience. And today we have Farheen. So thank you so much for doing this. I burdened you with reading quite a heavy text. And I think you were kind of tricked into doing it by Zareen, who said, like, why don't you read something? And you thought it was a children's book, and this is not a children's book. But the reason that I had reached out to her to reach out to somebody with the humanitarian experience is because the book deals with the question of like, why is it that humans wage war when it makes no sense? And you worked in Sudan over like two different decades, so I mean you also saw it in two very different stages, and I would love to hear what the difference was. And then you worked in Afghanistan, so your experience in combat zones, even after the conflict, I think gives you an interesting insight into the text. The text is difficult because it's somewhat academic. There's a lot of like references. There's a lot of just a lot of history that she's trying to condense, and she's trying to come up with an answer. But I don't think there is an answer. Like, the war is a question in itself, and we're kind of left with maybe with hope at the end, maybe not. But yeah, I would love to hear your take on it, and I know it's been hard, and I'm really grateful that you tackled it. So yeah, without further ado, Farheen, take us on this ride through Blood Rites.
Through Blood Rites. Thank you. I am okay. Sorry, just need to fix one thing with the screen.
Yeah.
How can I just show myself just the book and not just the book and not the windows?
Right now it's like really big for me personally.
Okay.
No, like it's big, and then I have a side panel with people.
Yeah, I want to get rid of the side panel. How do I get rid of the side panel? Sorry, is somebody speaking?
Farheen, it's okay. I think like we can see it, and
Yeah.
So like we can enlarge it to see it as well.
Yeah.
So don't worry about that.
Okay. All right. So thanks for that, Katrina. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Zareen, for thinking of me when asked about the book. I'm not sure whether you knew this, but when you had asked me to be an elder sister, I took it very literally. And I thought that it would be, of course, for an elder sister to read young children books. And when I received the PDF text, I was a bit taken aback, but also happy to get to read something like this. So Barbara Ehrenreich, she is a sort of an alternative scholar in that she doesn't remain within all the lines of established sort of PhD dictated type of intellectual work. She's an independent, she's what is called an independent thinker and scholar, which means she rigorously doesn't stick to one discipline, but reaches out to other disciplines whenever she's trying to answer a question. So this is why this book is quite has been quite difficult to sort of wrap my head around, because once we're talking about history, we're talking about anthropology, we're talking about sociology, we're talking about archaeology, all those things. And you know what, in the end, that's what is required for a topic like this, because it is what you call one of these things that's a cross-cutting topic. So with that, I will jump to the book. I'm now scrolling. Is it scrolling for you? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So to start, please, I will ask for everyone's forgiveness for this being my first time doing a reading like this online. So please bear with me if things are a little bit lengthy or repetitive or not explanatory enough. Do stop me whenever you like. You can wait until the end of the reading, or you can jump in the middle, raise your hand, or just speak up. Don't worry, I will not be distracted. So whatever is comfortable for you. So as I looked up Blood Rites, I read a bit online about the book before I started reading the book itself. It's about war, as it seems like, but it's more about many things related to war, rather than why wars continue. It's more about why war started, or why it may have started, or what led to its existence, rather than why it continues even now, because why it continues even now is probably related to contemporary conditions. This book was published 26 years ago in 1997. There is an excellent write-up review about it from around that time. I will post the link on the page of this reading, so others who are interested in this book and would like to learn more or read more, or wouldn't like to read the book but read a comprehensive review of it, you can take a look. So it was published 26 years ago, and I think there's been 2 editions of it, which means it doesn't cover our most recent wars. It doesn't cover the war in Afghanistan that started in 2001. It doesn't cover the war in Iraq right after that, which has stopped, and it certainly doesn't cover the war in Ukraine, which is what is most relevant to our discussions, thought, and attention right now. That said, I think we can use this book as a backdrop and talk about more contemporary issues if the group feels like that. I imagine that I would be short of words, so I picked up a few reviews of the book, also helped by Katerina, and I would like to read those few reviews to kind of warm us up to what we are going to look into. And Katerina, tell me please feel free to co-read. Not a problem. And I'll read a couple of reviews which will help us talk about the material, and then I will go into the material itself. So this is one of them. In Blood Rites, Barbara Ehrenreich confronts the mystery of the human attraction to violence. What draws our species to war? and even makes us see it as some kind of a sacred undertaking. Blood Rites takes us on an original journey from the elaborate human sacrifices of the ancient world to the carnage and Holocaust of 20th century total war. Notice it doesn't talk about 21st century. Sifting through the fragile records of prehistory, Ehrenreich discovers the wellspring of war in an unexpected place. It is not in a killer instinct unique to the males of our species, but in blood rites that early humans performed to reenact their terrifying experience of predation by stronger carnivores around them. This book is brilliant in conception, rich in scope. It's a monumental work that will transform our understanding of the greatest single threat to human life. That's one person. The premise of this book is that we go to war and participate in other bloody rituals primarily to act out our legacy of a time when we have to be aggressive, to avoid being eaten by predators. After all, she claims, only those of our ancestors who were most prone to violence in the face of, say, an attack by a saber-toothed tiger would have lived to pass their genes on to us. So it is something that our ancestors would have had to engage in to survive. So that it may have been a survival instinct, which sounds very likely. She also makes some interesting arguments. One of them is that men are the fighters of our species, not because of superior strength, but because they're essentially disposable. There is a gender dimension to this book that she tackles. So yeah, this is back in the 90s and gender is being tackled with her back then, which shows wide and diverse scholar that she is. And I will say that statement of men being the fighters of our species, because, we can lose a few of them. What it made me think is that, reproductively, a male's contribution is negligible, rather the matter of a few moments, whereas a woman's engagement and commitment to the propagation of the species, survival of the fetus, survival of the child, the infant, is many orders of magnitude more extensive. The writer also points out that the relative difference in strength between men and women would have been entirely meaningless with the attack of a predator of far greater strength, because fighting a predator depends more on skills and tactics rather than just pure strength. So there is no natural reason for men to go hunting and for women not to. Hunting at that time was a product of alliance more than of strength. So what it goes to show is that men and women had very similar equal roles in society before gender roles were defined after the settling down of ancient humans. And therefore, the division of labor probably had to do perhaps more with economic reasons than with physical or gender-based ones. Ehrenreich details too how we have made war sacred. So there's a connection between religion and war that she details really interestingly. We will read about that. She calls it a secular religion propped up by quasi-religious rituals and traditions, and some of which that persist even today. And we can think of that as in the USA, maybe Memorial Day for us, Independence Day, then Victory Day. They're all connected to winning a war or winning against an adversary. Ehrenreich surveys an enormous range of scholarship. She claims to be properly awed by her subject, and she seeks to nudge and provoke readers and not to overpower them. She says not to overpower them, but it is pretty overpowering material. She uses a pretty welcome approach, and she writes in contrast to the stern pontificating style of many other writers who are usually male and authorities on war. So this was one female voice when this book was written. And as she's writing it, she very aptly admits that she, as a reckless amateur, is rushing in where the prudent scholar has feared to tread. So that's the intro, and with that, we're at about 15 minutes in. I think I will go into the reading, and I'll first jump to page 9 of, if anyone's following the PDF, page 9 of the PDF. Any thoughts thus far? Suggestions? And if you want to read, please, anyone that knows now that they would want to read a little bit, do you want to write me a small note in the chat box or raise your hand, and I can happily select you for some of the readings? No interests yet. Okay, Katerina, you want?
I'll read at any point that you're tired.
Okay. Let's see. So she starts the book in, is there somebody coming in, or am I losing?
No, that was me sharing.
She starts the book with the theme of gender, because war often is talked about as some kind of a male activity, an original preoccupation, forms of organized and socially sanctioned violence, such as rituals of blood sacrifice. A deeper and far more explanatory theme emerged for her. So she says, after she moved on from that gender aspect of treating war as a social activity undertaken by societies in the past and in modern times, she moved past the gender-based proclivities and found that maybe it's more connected to rituals of blood sacrifice undertaken together as communities that explain wars a bit more. And she uses Tolstoy to talk about one of the causes of war. The deeper we delve in search of these causes, and more of them we discover, and each single cause or series of causes appears to us equally valid in itself and equally false by its insignificance compared to the magnitude of the event. So what she's affirming is that, yes, war can be explained by one or two different kinds of motivations, but it can be explained by many. And in the introduction, I want to read out something that's written by a fellow author and a journalist. She speaks highly of, he speaks highly of the book, and from his point of view, he looks at war from his experience as something that is intricately connected to bloodletting, and not so much as strategy and policy. He talks about Stalin. Stalin saw cruelty as the cutting edge of history. He thought of war as something that was undertaken to change the course of history. I admittedly, with less experience than he had, am inclined to say it is blood. If it bleeds, it leads. As a species, we spill blood, and as a species, we are transfixed by its spilling. The fascination and the exaltation of killing is one of the realities of human nature, and in its embodiment as war, perhaps the preeminent driver of human history. So as a war correspondent, he obviously sees that war is a definitive way to impact history. It's from his firsthand experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too from my experience as well. And he calls this a masterful creative inquiry, unfolding and giving much pleasure in making the book a valid and gripping read. Mark Dana, who has covered war and political conflicts for 3 decades in the Balkans, Iraq, Central America. So the material is so extensive. Oh, sorry. So that's the Azan. Hold on. Do you think I should continue, or is it sort of loud for everybody?
I can't hear it at all.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, good. Before going into prehistory and the human inclinations from ancient times that she uses to discredit the theory of war coming out of the inclinations of aggressive hunter males. In fact, that is an argument she thoroughly tries to stomp on. She claims that our aeons-long status as a prey created a long-running fear and admiration of animal predators. So we will discuss and talk about her theory of how she looked at, she thinks human beings' existence first as preys before we became war-making machines. That's one of the reasons we have evolved to be as we are. And she has drawn some parallels between ancient religions, which with their blood-soaked rituals, and the fact that for thousands of years, small bands of humans had to ward off predators in the shape of tigers, lions, bears, and wolves, all without the weapons that we have today. She tries to fill in a picture of the psychology of war. And one reader I found online adding that religious rituals were not the cause of war, or rather the effect of the ancient status of human beings as the prey that was offered up to the gods. So she starts off the book by talking about wars in the recent centuries, the wars after the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, as we call them. And she says, war in its famous aphorism is merely a continuation of policy by other means, which is what a Prussian officer, Clausewitz, has talked about in his theory. And his theory is quite widely studied and touted. And he says, war is a continuation of policy by other means, which means that war is an undertaking taken on by humans and modern individuals and countries and societies. And we're talking about the state system. They're saying that it's a form of policy. And this theory was actually taken on for a long time in the 19th and the 20th century, I believe. And it was talked about as though war is the result of some clear-headed deliberation that one might apply to a game of chess. And nation states were the leading actors on the stage of history, and war was simply one of the many ways they advanced their interests against those of other nation states. So you see something very clean, nicely packaged, cut and dried. You decide that you want to go into war, you prepare for it, you go into it. But post the Napoleonic Wars, and as we get into the First World War, some of the theories started changing, and it talks about, well, Freud talks about something. Freud was eventually led to conclude that it is some dark flaw in the human psyche, a perverse desire to destroy, countering eros and the will to live. So in crude summary, the theories of war, which modern wars have left us with, that war is a means, however risky, by which men seek to advance their collective interests and improve their lives. This is what we have as a result of scholarship. And scholarship says that, or said that it's a risky means, but it improves our collective interests or our collective chances. And we do it for a geopolitical advantage. And it was in the 60s and 70s that debate on the psychology of war that we talked about, aggressive instinct, male instinct, was discredited. In the 60s and 70s, she writes, the debate on the psychology of war centered on the notion of an aggressive instinct peculiar to all humans or only to human males. Well, I'll agree with all humans, because both men and women have the aggressive instinct to protect and also to occupy. So that debate was no longer propagated after the 60s and 70s, when more organized geopolitical reason was forwarded. Although it is true that aggressive impulses up to and including murderous rage can easily take over in the heat of actual battle, even this statement must be qualified to take into account of different weaponry and modes of fighting. Hand-to-hand combat may indeed call forth and even require the emotions of rage and aggression, if only to mobilize the body for bursts of muscular activity. In the case of action at a distance weapons, however, like guns and bows and arrows, emotionality of any sort can be a distinct disadvantage. Coolness and the ability to keep aiming and firing steadfastly in the face of enemy fire prevails. So you see, you can't be berserk or really hot-headed, because that adrenaline-driven, rage-driven instinct can last for a battle, but not for a whole war, because wars require preparation for training, organizing supply, transport, and many other logistics, which that argument just doesn't bear out. War, in other words, is too complex and collective an activity to be accounted for by a single warlike instinct lurking within the individual psyche. So we need some other type of instinct that would mobilize the entire community or the country. And she adds another argument over here, which says that war is something, despite the aggressive instinct, war is something that does not come naturally to the human being. Because for war, we have to take on a warlike get-up. A transformation is required. And in ancient societies, and even in the modern one, she actually goes to describe how some societies have gone on to prepare men, maybe women too, for war, which actually rallies them. So the act of rally. And maybe to start it off, maybe I can ask Katerina to read this paragraph, often the transformation.
Often the transformation is helped along with drugs or social pressure of various kinds. Tahitian warriors were browbeaten into fighting by functionaries called rawiti, or exhorters, who ran around the battlefield urging their comrades to mimic the devouring wild dog. The ancient Greek hoplites drank enough wine, apparently, to be quite tipsy when they went into battle. Aztecs drank pulque. Chinese troops at the time of Sun Tzu got into the mood by drinking wine and watching gyrating sword dancers perform. Almost any drug or intoxicant has served in one setting or another to facilitate the transformation of man into warrior. Yanomamo Indians of the Amazon ingest a hallucinogen before called halma, which is believed to have induced a frenzy of aggression. So if there is a destructive instinct that impels men to war, it is a weak one and often requires a great deal of help.
Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead. Was that somebody? Okay. No, so I'll continue. And I thought this bit was really interesting in how many different types of examples she gives and how many different threads of history she picks up from to show that war, a fight, may be a natural instinct, but war cannot be a natural instinct. It's an organized activity. And it takes place because of thought and preparation. And to go into war, there has to be rituals to prepare men and women to kill, to actually change this part talks about a psyche change, that things which are ordinarily called, things which are ordinarily ascribed with negative values are reversed in war, right? In war, one should kill, one should steal, should burn cities and farms, should perhaps even rape matrons and little girls. Whether or not such activities are natural or at some level instinctual, most men undertake them only by entering what appears to be an altered state, either induced by drugs or lengthy drilling, and denoted by face paint back in the day, or in remote cultures, or khakis, which is the case of present day armies. So to wage war, men must take themselves out of their natural mindset and put themselves into a different kind of warlike mindset so that they can commit some of the acts and atrocities of war. And once you return from that war, what do? Returning warriors may go through challenging rituals before they can celebrate victory. And ancient cultures had some rituals that would involve like giving something to, or like a head of an enemy or a skull to a god to close the act of war, to receive closure and come back into normal society, so that the warrior is no longer in that mind frame of fighting. And in today's peacekeeping, we have a concept of DDR. It's called disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, which is what is needed for armies to come out of war, or an activity that is done after a peace agreement is signed, to reintegrate fighters back into society, both men and women. It's happening in many countries in Africa. It's happening now in Sri Lanka after the peace agreement has been signed, and so on. So it's a very familiar concept in post-conflict disciplines. And one of the things that I want to add to this part, the joy of overcoming the pain and death, summing up all the other ecstasies, the social intoxication, the feeling on the part of individual of being a part of a body. So in addition to that, the indoctrination and the drugs and the hallucination, all the things that you need to be swept into battle, to find the thrill of it, it also, the role of becoming part of a larger whole, of a larger machine, is also one of humankind's greater highs, as she explains it. And it's one argument that I can also relate to, and I will agree with, saying, yes, the notion of going into war it acts as a sort of magnet, the idea that you're part of a bigger whole. But then a counter argument to that is also the fact that anti-war demonstrations, which we'll talk about at the end of our discussion, also have a mobilizing capacity when people feel like they're part of a bigger group and they get into anti-war rallies and so on. When we talk about religious aspect of war, I'll come back to this. The word sacrifice summed up the religious passion of war for generations of Europeans and Americans. And for Asians too, I'm sure. In the rhetoric of religious militarism, killing the enemy was almost an incidental outcome of war compared to making the supreme sacrifice of one's own life. So war has actually helped human beings to overcome an instinct of self-preservation, which is a primeval, primary human instinct to become a part of something, to become a part of a larger cause. Because self-sacrifice, as all sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists will talk about, self-sacrifice is perhaps the least rational of all human undertakings. Anthropologists may debate whether it is rational in a self-serving sense to fight for land or women or to avenge some kind of wrong. So we see that we're moving man from a rational state of mind to perhaps a religious state of mind. I'm sorry, it pits rational against religious in this case, but it does, and fighters would have to leave behind the rational instinct of self-preservation to get into a warlike mindset. And why do the religious dimension make sense? Because it is religiosity of war above all, which makes it impervious to moral rebuke. See, when you want something to not be discredited easily, you can ascribe religious meaning to it. For millennia, and long before the Enlightenment or even the teachings of Jesus, people have understood that war inverts all normal morality, that it is, by any sane standard, a criminal undertaking. War is criminal, see, it is there. But somehow we overturned that. Buddhism, arising in the 5th century BC, condemned war, and one of the most bluntly reasoned anti-war argument ever made comes from Chinese philosopher Mo Ti. When one man kills another man, it is considered unrighteous and he's punished by death. Then by the same sign, when a man kills 10 others, his crime will be 10 times greater and should be punished by death 10 times. Similarly, if a small crime is considered crime, but a big crime, such as attacking another country, is applauded as a righteous act, can this be said to be knowing the difference between righteousness and unrighteousness? So some kinds of passions are enlisted to move our sense of righteousness to a different sense at the time, and only religiosity can help us do that. So World War I, which is what Freud had talked about, not all wars, of course, have excited the kind of passion aroused by World War I. But does the fact that humans can and often do sacralize the act of killing mean that we are more vicious than any other creature? Or is it the other way around? With our need to sacralize the act of killing, that we are deep down, ultimately moral creatures. So are we fighting wars and then justifying it afterwards? Or we truly believe that it's justified and religiously sanctified? So that's something tricky. It was a difficult thing for me to wrap my head around. Any thoughts, any ideas, suggestions? If you want to jump in, please do.
Yeah, I guess, and part of the reason why I chose this book is, of course, because like since February, like my country has been pulled into a war, and part of the reason of choosing this book is trying to kind of find ways of looking at it, and dealing with it. But when reading it, I was always thinking that there's two different parts, you know, there's like the attacker and the attacked. For the attacked, it's very clear why you're fighting, that it is a moral battle because it's a battle for survival and self-defense, but it's the attacker that has to justify the act, and how they justify it is like often pulling in these religious and moral ideas, and nationalistic ideas, and nationalism raised to the level of religion. So it was interesting to read that for me.
Yeah.
How did
yeah.
And then it's
no, you're on exactly the point that's coming up next, that human beings have a certain kind of philosophy and ethos which says don't kill or don't get killed and so on, and you can relate to your enemy. I mean, we're one of the only ones that kill our own kind, right? But we're also one of the most intelligent beings, and it is this intelligence we're using in a very sophisticated way to justify and turn around the argument to perceive a risk from one of our own kinds and say that we would become prey otherwise if we don't kill this group. So it's a function, it's a factor of our intelligence that allows us to take on that persona or a collective persona for which we can kill. Whereas in the past, in ancient times, and also for other beings, it is the taste of meat and the willingness to kill for it is what makes them go forward to kill or to hunt. So we are a species of predators who are natural born killers, who carried the habit of fighting over into the era of herding and farming, which means that we are not in an era where the same threats exist, which gave us the instinct of fighting, but we are still carrying on that instinct and continuing as a predator, but now to our own species. And I think we've talked quite a bit about this predatory instinct, and now I'm going to move on to the religious part of it. And I think we've talked about religious ritual as well. Look at my notes a little bit. 31, 34. I need to get to page 34. One gory thing that she talks about quite at length is about human sacrifice and bloodletting. That was passive throughout the classic period, so the ancient Greek and the ancient Roman period, that human sacrifice, which is not studied so extensively, sacrifice of other animals is studied, but what she talks about in respect of that is that even without accompanying rituals or acts of violence, the flow of blood is an arresting spectacle. The color alone demands attention and calls to mind violent acts of piercing or cutting, the shocking sameness of all living creatures beneath the skin. So the ritual of animal sacrifice held human beings and human societies in a kind of thrill or awe. It was a natural exhibition of power. So kings and emperors would gather their subjects and and sacrifice some kind of an organism to show their strength and to express their power over their people. Among the ancient Greeks, nothing of any importance could occur. No decisions could be made without the accompanying flow of sacrificial blood. Funerals required sacrifices, as did celebrations and homecomings, vows and agreements. Risky ventures such as journeys and wars could not be undertaken without sacrifices, both to reveal the likely outcome and to win the support of the gods. During campaigns, the military leader served also a priestly role of the sacrifice. Calamities and misfortunes could, of course, be overcome only through appropriate sacrifices. In fact, one of the major functions of the famed Delphic oracle was to regulate the economy of sacrifice, to dictate which creatures had to be sacrificed, in what quantities, and to which gods, in order to achieve the desired results. Large animals such as bulls counted more than small ones. Quantity was another important measure of devotion. The historian Xenophon says, the Athenians had vowed to Artemis to sacrifice as many goats as they could kill Persians, but they could not find enough goats, so they resolved to sacrifice every year 500, and so they do so still. So that's how many humans the Persians lost. Persians were killed by the Greeks in ancient wars. So yeah, it has had a huge symbolism. And another scholar says animal sacrifice was an all-pervasive reality in the ancient world. Hebrew animal sacrificial ritual resembled that of the Greeks, which in turn resembled that of Egyptians and Phoenicians and Babylonians and Persians, the Etruscans and the Romans. Names of gods differed, but the rituals were the same. All these bloody rituals belong to the same category of socially sanctioned violence, which is where we might locate war, and appear to be speaking to some of the same concerns as war. Death is clearly among these concerns, as is the power to bring about death, to kill, or at least to draw blood. If nothing else, both war and ritual bloodlettings are spectacular demonstrations of human power to injure and to kill. Religion, in its broadest sense, must be another term for that obscurity that surrounds man's efforts to defend himself by curative or preventative means from his own violence. It's quite provocative an idea that we say that we are effectively using religion. So whether religion is divine or not, it actually gives us the tools and the justification to carry on with some of the acts that we would otherwise denote as not moral. Let me move ahead to
Zareen, you have a question?
Question, comment. When Farheen, you were reading, two things I was kind of thinking, like just listening to Katrina and you later on. One is like about sacrifice, how we still sacrifice, right? In our culture as well. It's a big thing, and you know, we grew up with that, and to some extent, like it normalizes, you know, like, and it's we do it because of religion, but also what I see is that with affluence, I think like your religious opinions change, because I think like religion kind of focuses on the masses, right? So then you choose to opt out. And also like in this war between Ukraine and Russia, like when they're enlisting soldiers in Russia, like it's the upper class or the well-off, they opt out, because then I think like you can afford to do that, or you have the resources to kind of like leave that country. Or otherwise, if you are kind of part of the masses, and either, like, then you're kind of captive, and you have to be that soldier, you have to be that warrior, you have to be that person who sacrifices in the name of religion. So I was just thinking about that, and wanted to share.
Yep. And you have spoken. Katrina, do you have anything to say?
I want to say that when the war started and I was trying to get my mom out, Zareen sacrificed a goat and fed a bunch of kids, and I thought that was the sweetest thing ever.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Zareen, did you do that? Oh my God.
Yes, I did. I sent it to an orphanage. Like, I sacrificed because of that. Her mom has the safe passage to Poland,
and she did.
So yeah. So so we do believe in that, like a life in exchange of a life.
Yeah.
So that's where
Janet Sotka. Janet Sotka, we say that.
So,
yeah. So Jan is life, right? Jan Sotka is that is your sacrifice.
Your life, yeah. So in exchange of another life, another human life, you're sacrificing and
this is the perennial argument.
I'm very grateful.
Perennial argument that we're having for Eid, Bakri Eid, right? Eid al-Adha, where we're talking about God. Does he really need a sacrifice of how many beasts there were last year? Like 7 lakh or 20 lakhs of animals?
It's like a million.
Yeah, some number that's unthinkable. And really, what brownie points are we getting? What gains or what religious gains are we making from that? And slipping back into the book, it's about interpretation. Practitioners of sacrifice have interpreted the rite in a highly specific and concrete way. Sacrifice is the means by which humans feed the god or gods. The victim is in fact a meal. And that is in the prehistoric times of the Olympian gods, and that it is now for us. Thus, the Olympian gods savored the smell of roasting meat arising from the sacrificial altars. At least in the work of ancient Greek comic poets, complained about the size of the share of their meat. The Aztec sun god would be extinguished without its steady diet of sacrificial human blood. The Mayan gods seem to have required blood for sustenance. Inca gods ate sacrificial llamas. Hawaiian gods smacked their lips at the sight of their intended victims. Hebrew God was too ethereal to be imagined actually eating. But in the Bible, the divine fire sometimes spurts forth excitedly and consumes the flesh lying upon the altar. And in the theory of war, another theorist says, one actually sacrifices what is useful. So Zareen, feeding the orphans. He writes, precisely to lift that thing out of the realm of utility and into the realm of immanence. Far more direct explanation of that is that the gods prefer a meal of meat. So it's a whole cycle where we are sacrificing for the gods, but it also has an implication for our well-being, the well-being of the priest who tells us to do it, the imam who tells us to do it. And I want to read this part really quickly because it has a bit of a South Asian reference. The temple of Kali in 19th century Calcutta could handle 800 goats in 3 days. Far more than Xenophon's Athenians could muster. The temple serves simply as a slaughterhouse for those performing the sacrifice, retain their animals, leaving only the head in the temple as a symbolic gift, while the blood flows to the goddess. So the head remains, and the meat and the muscle and the sinew goes to people. So there is a there's a counterbalance to this theory, which I found over here. Humans are killers, according to this hypothesis, but somehow not natural killers, like lions or wolves. Only through consolations of religion and ritual could our species sustain its bloody career. So it goes back to saying what we need to do to actually kill or to justify is that we need to prop up a theory against the act. We can't do it just by our instinct of killing. We need a theory or a cause that is larger than individuals, larger than all of us, and then we kill in the name of it. And that is what has discredited the hunting hypothesis. And the human beings being the actual hunters, has now declined to the status of myth. We are not natural-born hunters. The real problem with the hunting hypothesis is that it completely obscures an aspect of the human-animal relationship, which have been far more important in shaping human evolution, because there's more of a dependence than there is of dependence and cohabitation than there is of actual aggression. Human beings and animals were in the same boat because hominid and animal remains were found together in a lot of paleontology in the Paleolithic era, indicating that both humans and other animals were praised, the larger carnivores at the same time. So humans had to actually protect themselves back in the Paleolithic era, and therefore a man was to begin with a prey before becoming a predator. So that's something we can discuss and talk about. Let me jump to the next part. And humans and animals, another sign of humans and animals being preyed together was that large carnivores in recent times, or even in the last centuries, have preyed on humans, especially when humans have encroached upon their territory. And there were some examples, like in Uganda, a railways project, in the Sundarban valleys, where widows of tiger widows live, and also general understanding that primate meat is not liked by predators. And wolves do not hunt humans so much to eat as just to protect themselves, and so on. So early humans were not just predators, but they were praised together with other animals. And early humans also scavenged. So larger carnivores, when they would kill, humans not only hunted for their meat, sometimes they would scavenge the hunt of other larger carnivores. And sometimes when that carnivore came back to the spot of the hunt, would kill humans as well. So the experience of being prey is actually quite high in the human psyche. So the need to protect, the need, the dilemma, the panic, the frenzy of being hunted, of being a prey is primordial. And that leads to a lot of our later acts of killing and being able to kill. And I want to jump to I thought about strategy. Sorry, if you can just give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Katerina, do you want to let me just give you a part to read?
Yeah, and I also want to say, since we don't have that much time, and you've done the work of reading it for us, I would love to hear what you think of it all. Human technologies were also changing. The first evidence of artificial fire making, an iron pirate's ball with deep grooves from repeated striking, comes from a Belgian site only 15,000 years old. And it was only about 15,000 years ago that our ancestors developed effective action at a distance weapon, like the bow and arrow, that did so much to make there, that did so much to make our species the most dominant animal on Earth. So we could say, without disrespect to the known facts, that there were at least two broad and overlapping epochs in prehistory, one in which our ancestors confronted the world, for the most part, as potential prey, and another in which they took their place among the predators, which had for so long oppressed them, an epoch of cowering and perpetual vigilance, and an epoch in which other species learned to cower and flee from us. The transition from one status to the other would have been halting and gradual, as the means of defense, both weapons and forms of social organization, evolved into the means of attack and offense. So and for me, like this was quite an interesting thing to read and like explore her anthropological like imagination and into that transition where we're first hunted and we're terrified of everything, like when there's no moon in the sky and there's total darkness and there's like beasts. And I think she describes the quantity of tigers that roamed the subcontinent, and it's terrifying to imagine these cats just like everywhere, and you have nothing but, you know, a rock against it. And then this transition from that state to the state of like I can kill, and the dying out of big animals. That was such an interesting thing to imagine, and then how she talks about nightmares that haunt children, even children that have never seen beasts. They're kind of like, this is something that's coming out from a bigger memory, and it's kind of a Jungian take on it. But because we have so little time, what I want to hear is how, like, because I know that not everything is agreeable here to everyone. Like the book is very alternative academia, so I wanted to hear like what your impressions of it were, and if it answered any questions for you, or if it raised any questions for you, and also if you were able to interpret your experiences differently, or did it shed light on your experience in any way? And also another question that I have is, because you worked in post conflict, how do you undo or dismantle those warrior psyches and that destructive tendency, and how do you integrate people back into peace? So that's the second part of my question. You're on mute. 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 We can't hear you. Farheen, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's muted. So we haven't even gone through the fourth of the book, but thank you for helping summarize that first part. The book is essentially parts. The first part is the instincts and what has taken us to war, and the second part is hold on. The second part is the actual carrying out of the war, and this table of contents actually can help us with. Help me with sort of figuring out how I want to end this discussion. And which did this book help or relate to my experiences? There was one thing, yes, that really sort of resonated with how I kind of helped strung or threaded the act of the ancient prehistoric act of men fighting in small groups and using the weapons that they did, and then war changing over the centuries to an activity now where small groups don't fight. There are no knights who are the leaders in a certain battle. There are no very skilled, there infantry, or especially when infantry came into existence, which is gunpowder. When it came into existence, it totally changed the nature of war from something that was heroic and undertaken by the royalty of a certain group. So the movement from feudal states and empires, where kings and lords were the leader of the people and the leader of wars, how did we end up here, where there's a professionalized army, where there are trained people, but our societal leaders are going into wars where they don't have to take any responsibility for the fighting, because they're not fighting. They are armchair philosophizing. They're sitting somewhere else, moving knobs and buttons, and that red button that Trump has for the nuclear missiles, where he has never seen the war except for occasional visits to by helicopter to Afghanistan or Yemen or Syria or Somalia, which heads of state sometimes their experience of war, right? So so the weapons and how weapons have changed over time have really changed how war can be waged. And it really seems to me that it is bad news for stopping future wars, because it costs so little in human terms for leaders to wage war. It only costs weapons. And the economy of war is so overwhelming that most industries stand to profiteer from wars rather than the other way around. I mean, the war-making industry actually made money during the Afghan and the Iraqi war. Like $3 trillion was spent by the US in Afghanistan. So where did the $3 trillion go? Because that was the expense of the US. $3 trillion was spent in the war economy of the US. That was not the expense of Afghans, right? The expense of Afghans is 8 million lives. Forgive me if I'm wrong. Okay, so it's in the lives that's lost. In Iraq, there's a website called the Iraq Body Count. So they experienced the war in human terms, whereas Americans experienced the war in dollar terms, and loss of some number of soldiers, which are orders of magnitude lower than the countries where they are fighting. So this is possible because of the mass-scale, widespread weapons that they're using. And now in future, what we're going to see is drone warfare, which actually dehumanizes the victim even more and makes it easier to perpetrate casualties. And it is a time of real great concern, where only moral studies can help us understand and regulate that kind of policy. One quick statistic I want to share, given us from her research, is that the combat that was in the time of World War I was more upfront and hand-to-hand, and the casualties were 15% civilian casualties, right? And which means 85% casualties are people who are fighting the wars, which is soldiers and military equipment and military accoutrements. Whereas fast forward to World War II, 65% of the casualties are civilians, which means 35% are soldiers, which means what? That war has moved away from the battlefield, and war has moved to places which are inhabited by civilians. War has moved into civilian areas and towns and cities. There is no such thing as battlefield anymore, right? So that is also another for concern, because in today's day and age, war is producing refugees at an unprecedented rate. Right now, perhaps some 100 million people, by unofficial counts, are displaced from their homes. I'd like to pay my respect to the refugees of the Ukrainian war. The UN has a statistic of 5 Ukrainian refugees now displaced. That's not taking into account other people, other Ukrainians who are displaced from their homes within the country. These are Ukrainians who have left Ukraine. And this doesn't count all the countries that they have gone to. So 5 million people displaced. So more and more, I think, as we go into the future, we'll see different tactics of war leading to different types of casualties, and more human lives and livelihoods jeopardized as a result of that, and war not being limited to those who fight it and the countries that wage it. Like the war in Afghanistan, did the US feel the pinch of it? No. The war in Yemen, does the Saudi Arabians feel the pinch of it? No. I mean, Russians, are they experiencing the kind of displacement and loss of lives that Ukraine is doing at the moment? Not even in the same order of magnitude. So that's the less hopeful side of it. But like anything else in human history, human beings, we persist, we move on, we learn, we adapt, and we innovate. So war is something that has stayed with us from ancient times, from prehistoric times, and humans and the fittest humans have survived through it. So it gives me cause and reason to believe that the fittest among us will survive and come out at the other end of it. Thank you.
Thank you for ending on that note. But yeah, so the second part of my question was how do agencies like UN and other bodies deconstruct those tendencies, and like when a nation exits a long period of conflict?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm sorry I didn't write down the questions. I forgot the second part of your question, but that is very interesting. And when I can't claim that I know, I can't claim that I know the current scholarship on this topic, but I did study it 15 years ago when I was studying post-conflict in my master's, and the literature and the scholarship on this was not fully agreed on. There were different schools of thought on how to demilitarize, how to reintegrate, how to bring back warriors back into the society, how to disarm them, because a lot of societies continue to hold on to the arms, continue to hold on to the mindset and the traumas and the PTSD of the war, and they really become just very debilitated as a result of that experience. And there is not enough, or there used to be not enough effort spent in bringing people back to peaceful societies. And I don't know, I doubt if there is sufficient research and studies done on it, or sufficient budgets allocated to it to bring people back into peace. Because just as you need to mobilize people to get into war, you need to demobilize people to get back into peaceful societies, to act in peaceful ways. I think recently the most developed scholarship on post-war psychology is of the US war veterans who have come back from Afghanistan, because that presents us with a more or less comprehensive group of people to be studied. And there are people, and the US has the resources and the institutions to carry out that kind of research. Mm-hmm. So there are veterans who have done 1 or 2 tours of duty in Iraq, 2 or 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, and listening to them writing and talking about it. The the Washington Post has a magazine that used to come out. It has now since stopped. About 3 months ago, it has stopped. It was called At War, and it looks at these things. It looks at these things about these ideas of people reintegrating into society, and that talks about veterans.
Did you ever hear from your relatives and parents how that happened after the Liberation War? Because it seems like we hear a lot about the war itself, but and then we hear a lot about the Birangonas. So what happened to them after? But what happened to all the fighters that came back? Do you have stories about that?
No, I mean, just the fact that it seems to me that we're 50 years on from our war, right? And we are trying to right some of the wrongs 40, 50 years later, right? 5 decades later, 4 decades later, we started the International War Crimes Tribunal in Bangladesh, right? 2013. 5 decades later, we're still giving people the certificates of having fought in the Liberation War, because that certificate entitles you to some entitlements, a monthly stipend and all that, 10,000 taka. We're doing it so many years later. Why? Because it hadn't been done right after the war. The people who fought the war, like, there were other imperatives that had to be looked into. It was a starving country. It was a broken economy. It was, we needed food more than, so the needs were just so basic that higher needs like psychological needs and, reintegration needs were, for lack of a better word, not given priority to, I think. Yeah,
it was a different world.
Yeah, definitely a different world.
But also, I wonder if again, depending on which side you were fighting on, if for Americans coming back from a war and then like learning that it was unjust and learning that they participated in something that was wrong, that needs like a completely different approach than like fighters coming back home from a war that was righteous in every way and an act of self-defense. And coming back,
you used a very good word. The word righteous in war is used very often, and there are these Latin terms. There are 2 Latin terms in the theory of war called jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Bellum meaning war, and jus meaning justice, jus, J-U-S, right? So one is whether the war is justified or a just war. And the second is, has the war been fought in a just way? That means ethically. So was it ethical to get into that war? And has the war been fought using ethical means?
Right.
Jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And now, the thing is, the righteous, you have to present your case so in a way that you get your people to fight. And modern day wars, you have to get your army to fight and not to desert and not to, run away. And so you have to construct a narrative that's consistent. I'm not going to say true. It doesn't have to be true. It has to be consistent. So now, why is Tony Blair being taken to court in the UK for lying to the British people for going into war in Iraq? Because it was not a righteous war. It was not justified, right? And now the Iraq War Commission came out with a report that goes through clearly the sort of treachery that had taken place in British politics to justify that war. Now, that kind of transparency has taken place regarding the Iraq War in the UK. It has not taken place in the US yet, but we can hope that it will at some point. But the Iraq War Commission's report is damning enough for the UK as well as the US. So it makes sense to read that, given it's one of the seminal documents of our time to understand our history.
Yeah. Farheen, thank you so much. Thank you for reading this. Thank you for guiding us through it. I'm sorry we only got through a fourth of it.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't manage to make it more, didn't manage to encapsulate it.
You were
better.
perfect. Is there anything else that you want to share before we close?
I do want to quickly look at the last 2 pages of my notes and see if there was something interesting that we haven't touched upon. I think we've touched upon everything. How 20th centuries, yeah. So one of the things is 20th century and advanced weaponry and the ethics of war and the war medium, the propaganda that we need to get people to go into war, and the fact that elite fighters and emperors don't fight wars anymore. It's people who need a salary is the ones, and who need a good retirement package. Those are the ones who are going into voluntary armies like that of the US, right?
Yeah.
No, I think we are good. We've covered everything. I'm very happy we've covered everything.
Thank you so much. I'll just jump in. Sorry, Katrina.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Farheen. But so Katrina, if you also share what we do with this, you come up with a version of this later on, or is there an edited one that gets posted, or
yeah,
I'll
post the recording on the page, and then we share it in our newsletter. And then the book will be available once I'm back in the sister library. So if people want to read it, yeah. So and then we share the video throughout. Whenever we have other events and similar discussions, we share it. Is that what you meant? Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think this might interest you. Sorry, Katerina. This statistic is just, I think, for you. There was a, what was the term writer used? Fearful symmetries. In the part about symmetries, what the author talked about is war is something that two sides mirror each other in. Mm-hmm. So if your adversary has a certain capacity, you must have that capacity, and that perpetrates war.
Yeah,
that prolongs it. So that was a learning from Cold War times. That's you look at your neighbor, and your neighbor has a tall fence. You want to make your fence taller as well. Your neighbor has a big garage. You want a big car as well. So it's inherent in our mindset that we must protect our instincts and so on. So that's another interesting idea that she talked about when she talked about symmetries, that you always want to be symmetric. We want the same number of nuclear warheads that our adversary has, and that constantly pushes us towards a state of war. So on the flip side, de-escalation can be something that we can practice on both sides, and that's an anti-war technique. You de-escalate, and then your adversary de-escalates also. So that's a point of hope.
Yeah, I mean, it's very scary right now because that mirroring is happening with nuclear weapons, and I think it's probably like the scariest it's ever been, because so many countries now have because of that mirroring. If you have it, I'll have it, and that's terrifying because we're dealing with a cornered crazy person. What I find interesting in what war history is Japan. Like how a society went from like a very aggressive stance to being bombed so tragically and such a scale, and then went back to peaceful society, was completely demilitarized, and never had like aggressive impulses again. Because what we see in like countries like Russia, and they're using American injustice to justify theirs. They're saying, well, America did it in Iraq, so we can do it here. They did it to us, so we're going to do it to them. Whereas Japan just doesn't have that philosophy, which I find so fascinating and hopeful that maybe that's something that, like manga, can spread. Like, why don't we learn that?
Yeah, we can be hopeful about that. Although, I don't know. I haven't read sufficiently about Japan's post-war experience, which there is a dearth of literature about Japanese society transforming after World War II as a result of the trauma in that society as a result of that war, plus also the atomic bombs, the nuclear bombs, is very high. But I think in English language writings, I don't think there is enough written about it.
Mm-hmm.
But what I understand in broad brushstrokes is that how Japan recovered from that state back to a place of self-respect, because the emperor understood that Japan is a society that's very much about respect, and respect means everything to an individual, not wealth, right? So how you earn respect, how you gain respect, how you increase your respect, how you respect another person, and how the emperor motivated the entire society from a dejected state of loss is that he talked about how the Japanese can become a respected nation again. And you know what he talked about when he talked about that. So yeah, this is my vague, broad understanding. So please forgive me if something is amiss. But he said that we can earn respect by becoming an economic powerhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he triggered people to do. And he said, next X number of years, 30 years or 40 years, we are going to work. We are going to work in the factories. There is no concept of working hours in Japan. They were going to work their way into respectability, into a respectful society, because of their succumbing to that loss during World War II. So, even now, I think it's a very big deal on how they address that loss in World War II. So that was sort of their demobilizing, demilitarizing, and coming back into societies. That you work and you forget that trauma, and you look at a new rising sun.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just hope we have more leaders who can set goals and values that are not self-destructive or
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much. I hope to see you when I'm in Dhaka.
Yes, let us meet up. Thank you. This has been great. I have to admit, I was very scared when I first started reading it, but I'm so glad we did this.
I'm glad to hear, and thank you for doing it during such a transition in your life. Also, I understand that, like, switching jobs, and that must have been an additional load, but now it's over.
Over. So let me move this away. Yeah, it is done, and I will send one. I was mentioning one article from The Atlantic that you'll find fascinating. I think the readers would find fascinating also. I would send that.
Thank you. And Shoma will send a bookworm gift voucher. You get a gift voucher.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Look forward to that.